Okay, welcome everybody. I'm David Leighton Brown, the Master of Calumet College. Welcome to Calumet, or welcome back to Calumet, as the case may be. You know why you're here, but I want to give you a little bit, very little bit, of context about why you are here. Several years ago, there was a survey of students here at York University that expressed very clearly the sense that what students wanted more than anything else was to get to know faculty members better. They wanted to get to know what it is that professors actually do when they're not standing in front of a class delivering a lecture. And it was in response to that very clearly expressed desire on the part of students, reinforced by a whole lot of other evidence, that we designed this particular series of talks at Calumet College. I wish I could come up with a better name than the Faculty Research Profile Series, but that's what it is. I ask every professor in this series the same set of questions, and every one of the talks that they give is excitingly different. I ask, what are the questions that have interested you so much that you've devoted your entire career to studying them? And how do you study those questions? What is it that you actually do day after day after day? And what are some of the most interesting things that you've learned doing that over the 10 or 20 or more years that you've been doing so? So with those questions, today we're going to hear from Gordon Flett. I won't go into an extensive biography. I'll tell you just two important things. Gordon Flett is a Canada Research Chair, and for those of you who don't know, that's a big deal. Gordon Flett is formerly the Associate Dean for Research in the Faculty of Health, which was the capacity in which I first encountered him. And I know that all of us are in for a great hour. So I will turn things over to you, Gord.
Thanks very much. Hopefully you can all hear me. Of course, I'm going to spin those questions in a way that I try to provide a bit of a narrative. It'll be a disjointed narrative, because if I sat and talked about what I do, it would be kind of boring after a while in terms of the nitty-gritty of it. But I want to more so talk about why I do it, how we go about it, and some of the lessons that have been learned. But I was saying to David on the way over here that I just turned 55, which makes us eligible for early retirement. So I've been in this big picture type of thinking related to this. And also I was asked to give a talk about having a happy retirement for a group up in Orangeville, which again, when you turn eligible for retirement, makes you start to think of some of the big themes. So I'm going to just go through and highlight some of the things that I've come up with, but also how I got to this point and the journey that I was on. And knowing that the person who actually started my journey at York is sitting over there, who had been the chair in psychology. So it's kind of full circle. I've come now all this time, because I just got the notification to come to the 25-year at York celebration and get whatever they give you for that length of time. So you'll see, though, I've got some stories to tell. Since it's being taped, I'm not going to go into all the details I would, but I'll try to throw in occasional anecdote to illustrate some of the things that I've learned along the way and how that shaped my interest and insights into personality. And the main thing I study, which is perfectionism, which I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I will touch on as part of a broader approach to personality. So some themes I'm going to talk about. I think this series illustrates that professors are people too, and that everybody's got a story, so I'll be telling mine. And in my case, I want to illustrate how the role of fate or providence or just good luck comes into play in terms of some of the things that were going on. One of the other themes I want to address, basic reason why I study what I study is that personality is something that gets manifest in the real world all of the time. I said, like City Pulse TV, personality is everywhere. And I'm going to talk about some of the consequential life outcomes that have now been linked with personality differences just to illustrate this theme. And that's where the interest in perfectionism is clearly evident as well. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of what I've learned about personality and individual differences as it relates to that important topic of happiness and personal and professional development. And you can make your own decisions about what kind of personality characteristics I have at the end of the time. And as I said, and I will digress by telling the occasional story along the way to illustrate some of these themes. Now, my personal story going back into time, I started in 1976 as an undergraduate at the University of Toronto and the Arundel campus. And I wanted to tell a little bit about this because I was mentioning to David that my first 3 months were enough to convince me that I did not want to go on to second year in university. And I think that's important, you know, and I know the university here and elsewhere are increasingly concerned about that transition for students. So here I stand as now someone with a Canada Research Chair, but somebody who after about 3 months was ready to get out of the University of Toronto and take that job that my dad was dangling with the company car and go from there. One illustration of this, the very first thing that I did in university was a take-home exam in Introduction to Sociology. And the professor was someone who I think wanted to scare the students or teach them that it wasn't a bird course after all. So we did this take-home exam, and the class average was 45. And my mark, coming in as an Ontario Scholar, was 45. And my best friend's mark was 45. You see a trend emerging here. And I knew something was wrong because I always got 10 points higher than my friend, and he got 45. So I at least had a 55 coming, or maybe he should have got a 35. So we do what students don't normally do, especially male students are less likely to do this, I believe. We said, okay, professor said we could come and talk to him. Let's go actually talk to him. So, you know, we approached the door about 3 times, and finally we knock on the door, and there he is, the man who's given us all 45. And personally, he didn't leave that to a teaching assistant. He gave the 45s himself. And we said to the fellow, we said, you know, we're really wondering whether we should even be in university. You know, we got 45, we're off to a flying stop here. And, you know, maybe we are actually in the wrong place. And the professor, instead of treating us with sincerity and serious, because obviously we're there kind of perplexed, dazed, and confused, told us this fish story about how he was so upset by the class's abysmal failure that he saw that as a personal failure of his, and that he actually had tried to kill himself over the weekend by locking himself in a sauna, but the damn lock wouldn't work. We immediately offered to get him a new lock if he wanted to give it another try, knowing that we already had another professor coming in for the second part of that course. But obviously, he was just making that up. Yet here's students seriously wanting some help. And I had a few more experiences like that. Years later, when I'd gone on and was also a graduate student at the University of Toronto, I'd find myself in the same computer room, because in those days, we just had the common computer room. We didn't have the terminals, our own computers in our office. And I'd be sitting beside this same professor, and I wanted to wait till somebody important in the university came in and then said to this guy, so, have you tried to kill yourself again lately, like you told us you did? Have you fixed that lock problem? Anyway, that taught me, you know, first of all, we then got a new professor who came in. I quickly realized it's important to realize that personality differences exist among professors as well, and that you'll find the ones who can be sarcastic and not supportive, but they're fortunately much more outweighed by the ones who go in the exact opposite direction. So anyway, I continued, things got better, but in second year, I thought I wanted to go on to law school where marks were all important, but then said, wait a minute, there's something about this psychology that I seem to like, and decided that, you know, maybe I'd stick in psychology for a while and see what goes on. The interest in law, by the way, is something that goes on with our family, because our eldest daughter now is in first year at Osgoode here, and she decided to stick with the law, and always tells me whenever she can about that psychology business as a crock dad. And I'm saying, you know, you'll go on in law and you'll find that actually you're going to see psychology all the time in terms of that particular profession. So at the time, I decided, yeah, maybe someday I want to be a professor, but all I heard was doom and gloom. which is the title of the new Rolling Stones song, by the way, Doom and Gloom. Oh, there are no jobs. You're never going to get a job. So I wanted to say this, younger people thinking today, oh, there's no jobs, it's not a great time. But, if you have a vision and a dream, you've just got to keep trying and see what happens. But indeed, there wasn't really much opportunity out there at the time. But you have to hang on to something and just have faith that things are going to work out. And sometimes you're in the right place at the right time. Now we jump ahead. I was hired at York in 1987, 1988, at a time when I think people had had enough of the job interview experience at York. And at the time, I remember in my actual job talk, two of the faculty members had a dispute in the middle of the talk related to something that I said, and I was just getting bad vibes. And at the end of the day, I thought, well, I'm not picking up a positive feeling here, so I'm going to go home and mind my own business and finish my PhD. And then lo and behold, fortunately, I got a call from that gentleman over there in the summer, and he said, guess what? We actually have a job for you. And I said, oh, all those doom and gloom predictions are suddenly not true, because you only need one ticket, right? One ticket to play. But I found myself in a situation where I hadn't completed my PhD yet. I was in that ABD category, all but dissertation or all but done, as some refer to it. So this was the first times that I learned about the importance of the roles that you find yourself in and how that relates to how you're feeling about life and how that interacts with your own personality. Because it was pretty well set up that in the morning I would be at York as a faculty member dealing with the imposter phenomenon, thinking, how did they pick me? And in the afternoon, driving back to the University of Toronto, where I'm a student. So in the morning, I'm a professor. In the afternoon, I'm a student. And people at U of T are reminding me I'm still a student. So you've got to work that out in your mind in terms of feeling that. I had the same thing when I was asked to be associate dean. Suddenly, you're in a totally different world that you've had no preparation. And people talk about the interaction between your personality and the situation. Cattell talked in the early 60s about, more important than that, he said, was the interaction between personality and the roles that you find yourself in. And I became acutely aware of this. Virtually nobody's done work on this, except some people in the business literature on the person-environment fit. But how that personality jives with that role, there could be a match or a mismatch. And I was very acutely aware that the expectations, the factors that were involved were very different. And in terms of the imposter phenomenon, I have to tell you, anecdote number one, I could tell you this one without getting into trouble. Ron Okada in psychology was the graduate director when I began. And here's how my very first class, feeling like an imposter as a professor, started at York. I'm sitting in the class, looking around going, wait a minute. At the time, I was 29 years old and had hair darker and everywhere. I went, wait a minute, first of all, the students in the class are about 10 years older than me. This can't be right. They're the ones who are supposed to be teaching me. I'm not supposed to be teaching them. So I'm just catching on to this, feeling like a fish out of water. And I see a face at the door, and it's Professor Okada, the graduate director. And he says to me, I need to talk to you. And I said, well, what about? And he goes, well, technically, you're really not supposed to be teaching this class. I said, what do you mean I'm not supposed to be teaching this class? He goes, well, technically, you're still a graduate student teaching other graduate students. So you shouldn't be here by rules of York. And I went, oh, well, what does this mean, Professor Okada? He goes, it means if somebody comes to the door looking serious and asking you questions, I want you to pick up your stuff and get the hell out of there as quickly as you can. I said, are you serious? He goes, oh, I'm very serious. Don't answer anything. Just go right out of the building. So that's how I started my teaching career at York, by saying if somebody comes to the door, grab your stuff and get out of there as quickly as possible. So if you didn't already feel like an imposter at that point, now the other thing, just as an aside, I didn't know whether we were allowed to do this or not, but I'd been offered a chance to teach a course on introductory psychology at U of T at nighttime. And we needed the money as a family, so I was also doing this. And I thought, geez, I don't know if we're allowed to do this or not. I never, ever mentioned it to anybody. But I go in there, and this whole York U of T thing that's been built up over the years, I go into a lecture hall where I used to sit as an undergraduate, and I introduce myself and say that I'm a professor at York University. And before I can get to the part where I tell them that I used to sit where you sat, they boo me. 200 people booing is not a way you want to start your teaching career either. 200 people booing. So I just looked up at them and I said, I've got all of your names and your numbers, and you'll be hearing from me. And so those are my illustrious beginnings. Get out of the room as quickly as you can, and if you tell us about where you're from, we'll boo you. So now I'm going to talk about predictors of happiness, and you'll see a formula that's been widely accepted about what are the factors. And there's certainly, as I said, is a role for providence or good fortune to come into play here. And this has happened with me on several occasions, to the point I start to wonder if maybe there's somebody pulling the string somewhere and that this was actually supposed to happen along the way. One of the reasons I was told that I was hired at York is that Professor Norm Endler had got a Killam Fellowship, and suddenly there was a need for his courses to be taught. And they thought, okay, who do we have in who we'd interviewed who could teach those courses? So Professor Endler, who's no longer with us, sadly, reminded me every chance he got, you know, if I didn't have that Killam Fellowship, who knows where you would have ended up, but it wouldn't have been here. If you know him, that was kind of the gruff voice that you would hear. But I think about that in terms of the role of opportunity and chance. Like, literally, it was the case in the personality field that there hadn't been a job in like 20 years in the city area at all, when there wasn't a lot of hiring that was going on. But the other thing that happened, even though I received equal training as both personality and social psychology, because I was teaching those courses, suddenly I was described as the personality guy. Well, except by my dad, who said, "You, personality? I don't think so." I would tell him, of course, I was a chip off the old non-personality block. Anyway, so right away, though, you feel that suddenly you're labeled because, again, you're in a role where people are saying this is what you're doing. But really, my dissertation work was more focused on social psychology than personality, and my supervisor was a social psychologist. I was a teaching assistant for a social psychology course, but now I'm in this part of my professional role, and now I'm Mr. Personality. Now, good fortune number 2 was at the same time that I was hired, there were several other people that were hired in the psychology department. And one of them is my colleague and now lifelong contributor, Paul Hewitt, who was hired at the same time for a job in the clinical area. And this is where providence comes into play again, because as you know, if you're familiar with the York setup, when we have those courses where the instructor is that famous instructor named TBA, who seems to teach all around the campus. I'm not sure what TBA is, male or female, but TBA is everywhere, like City Pulse. Well, we are teaching those TBA courses, which are scheduled at the far outside regions of the campus. So we find ourselves, Paul Hewitt and I, walking out in the same direction. And one day he turns to me and he says, "So, do you know anything about personality?" And I said, "Well, why is the graduate program asking again? You know, like, are they?" He says, no, I have this idea for a scale to look at multidimensional perfectionism, and I need some insights on how to go about it. And I said, well, actually, I'm interested in the topic because I had read his previous paper on this, but I often think if we hadn't been walking out the same way, given the fact he was only at York for 1 year, after that 1 year, he left to go to the Brockville Psychiatric Hospital as a worker, I point out, as a worker, with a job that essentially doubled his academic salary. So if he had been 1 year earlier, I don't know, I would probably not be studying perfectionism. And again, it's an opportunity of where you happen to be in a place, and then we start to collaborate, we continue to collaborate, and we have now, I said at the Canadian Psychological Association conference without qualifying it, that Paul and I had been together for over 20 years now, and people thought we were actually a couple, which will be confusing when I get to the picture of my wife. But no, we're not a couple, but we are joined together research-wise, and it all started by going out in that walk out to the eastern part of the campus. Now, my interest in perfectionism, and objectively, if you look at it, we're still the only ones that have the only academic book on perfectionism, and regarded probably as the leading team, at least in the field. One aspect I've already mentioned was meeting Paul Hewitt and already having an interest. But I also want to talk about some other factors that influenced me in terms of why I ended up focusing on this as my main research topic. One was a family relevance that I didn't know initially, but very quickly learned, and then learned in an even bigger way. But also I'll talk about how I came to understand perfectionism through some encounters with York students along the way, and seeing the destructive impact that extreme perfectionism was having on some of these students. Now, in terms of the family component, and good fortune part 3, I call it, while I was at University of Toronto, I met my wife, Kathy, who was the departmental secretary in psychology. And how we started going out, I'll be careful what I say since I am on tape, but one day actually I was in complaining to the senior secretary, saying essentially, oh, all the good ones are taken, you know, I've given up sort of thing, and she's pointing at my future wife's empty chair saying, no, no, there's one there. And I said, no, no, she's married already. Well, she says, no, she wasn't. I'm arguing with her, of course, not knowing at all what I'm talking about, which people do all the time, right? Well, it turns out we started to go out because I found out, in fact, she was not married. I asked her out for a National Ballet Nutcracker show because 2 of the professors were appearing in there as stretcher bears, mice stretcher bears. And I said, even if she had no interest in me, I know she'd want to go see the show. So the rest is history, but little did I know, first of all, that I was marrying somebody who's an extreme perfectionist. And I found that out over time. We had a very short courtship, and then, but also a direct descendant of the one person in the history of the world that I would pick as the biggest perfectionist ever that we've ever had on the planet. And that's James Harrison, who I indicate here, her maiden name is Harrison, Kathy Harrison. And like Paul Hewitt, 29 years later, my wife and I are still working together. But let me tell you a little bit about Harrison here for your history buffs. Does anybody know what James Harrison invented? I didn't, and I was married to a direct relative, a descendant of his. James Harrison is the person who invented the chronometer to tell longitude at sea, whose story is told in a very short but amazing book by Davis Ovell called Longitude, which was made into a movie starring Jeremy Irons, who played Harrison. Harrison's story is that he worked on this chronometer to tell longitude at sea for over 50 years. He was an excessively obsessive, detail-oriented watchmaker who stuck with this task for 50 years. The chronometer originally was not called the chronometer. It was called Harrison 1, Harrison 2, Harrison 3. And if you look at anything to do Greenwich, the history of time, you'll see all these monuments to Harrison. And it turns out I, in fact, am married to somebody and have daughters who are direct descendants of the world's biggest ever perfectionist. We didn't know this initially. This came out when the book came out, and then some of the British side of the family told us about this. So I'm sitting there going, well, this is kind of funny. You know, is it really just an accident that I end up studying perfectionism, have based my career on it, and I am now married to someone who's descended from the biggest ever perfectionist, I think, in the history of the world. And this is a part I won't put on tape because I'll get into trouble, so I'll just talk about this Harrison, the chronometer inventor. One of the things that goes on with on perfectionists is this incredible tenacity, a stubbornness that their way is the right way and it has to be just so. In the case of Harrison, there was literally what they described as a king's ransom as a reward because the British wanted the military advantage and the health and safety advantage that would come from inventing the chronometer so that they wouldn't get off course, and huge military and economic advantage. But Harrison, somewhere along the way, didn't trust the adjudication board, so he wouldn't tell them how he invented the chronometer. He just said, here it is, it works. And it was only when the king stepped in and they said they were to hold up the prize that Harrison actually then told them how he went about it. But that's that dogged determination and stubbornness that is at the hallmark of extreme perfectionism, but nobody that I live with, of course. Speaking of them, Here they are. Wife Kathy is on the left. Our Osgood student Haley is in the middle. And Allison, who's a student at Carleton, is there. Allison started in journalism in the renowned journalism program at Carleton, and after about a year, like me, with the whole law thing, said, you know, Dad, I kind of like this psychology. And I went, psychology? No, get something that pays. But she's got a big component of her personality that's similar to me, which is that sort of need to want to protect people and, you know, look out for them. So she's joined a Student Mental Health Alliance at Carleton and is volunteering at CHEO in Ottawa and is doing quite well. But has also had some challenges in terms of some of the roommates that I'll tell off camera, but not on camera. And Haley's our one at Osgood. And in terms of life transitions, Haley was born the second half of my first year at York. So we had a lot of things going on at once there in terms of this. So of them, the two on the left are extreme perfectionists. And I won't go into our theory, but our elements of perfectionism include not only wanting to be perfect for oneself, but wanting other people to be perfect. On the left, we have that represented, and that's all I'll say. But Haley said, and this is the lofty goals of perfectionistic people, when we asked her in high school what she wanted to be, and she indicated an interest in the law, and we said, well, what do you want to be? And she goes, I want to be a judge. And I said, well, you've got the judging part down. And she goes, no, not just any judge. I want to be a Supreme Court judge. Because no, you don't set the bar here. You got to put it up here. Now, she was very fortunate while she was at Carleton to meet Canada's Chief Justice, who is a very influential woman with over 30 honorary degrees. So that's been quite an inspiration to her. So I have every expectation. I don't know if she'll be a judge, at least officially, but she's very deeply engaged in the Osgood program. She's the oldest, and she's almost not eligible for York benefits anymore. Now, I'm going to talk at various times. I've already talked about the role of fate and good fortune. I wanted to think of this framework as we go forward in terms of some of the other things that I'll be talking about. This, I believe you pronounce it Lubomirsky, but you may have seen a book. It was her book that was advertised and was out about 3 years ago. If you've seen a book that had a big cherry pie on the front, the pie was the thing that caught my interest right away. And based on her work on happiness and well-being and other people's work, came up with this formula that happiness is 50% pretty well fixed by your set point, where people have their basic level of typical happiness, and a big component of that is personality and genetic factors that will determine somebody's level of happiness. And I'm going to be talking about that personality aspect as one of my themes, obviously. But then it's allowed for that 10% could just be good or bad fortune, chance events. Sometimes you're in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time. So, and we know in life that can happen, and that's hard for some people to really cope with when it's been something bad that's happened. But 40% of people's individual happiness is up to them, according to this. Up to them in terms of self-management strategies, choices that people make, people they gravitate to, that either for good or for worse. That there is an element of this that is under personal control, according to what we see in terms of experiential factors that relate to happiness. Now, of course, there are huge individual differences in this. Some people have just had, bad luck, and this is what happens. And one of the very first things I learned in psychology as a student from my introductory psychology professor was, formulas like this may not ever predict the individual person because people can be so unique. But overall, when you have a group of people, this is how it turns out in terms of the various ways that the variance in happiness can be explained. So, and I'm going to be talking about those different components. I've already talked about the life events chance in terms of its role for my own existence here. Now, David said he wanted us to talk about what we do. I think most of you will be familiar with the formula that it's not just about research. We also, of course, are teachers. And one of the points I wanted to make that I know is an issue at York is this sense that if you're somebody who does a lot of research and holds a Canada research chair, that you don't like to teach. Well, in fact, I like to teach more than I do research. And what I've said is that, the people who are dedicated, what is a common factor here is the pride in wanting to do something that makes a difference, whether it's research or teaching. And to me, really what's keeping me going now, since, I say, well, I wanted to have a book, I have this and that. To me, I'm really focused on wanting to contribute to the well-being of students I'm working with, especially those who are thinking they want to pursue a career, and trying to look at things from that perspective, because that really does make a difference to me. And service, we talk about these three things as if they're independent, but I've found that it was through some of my engagements in the service component, starting with being undergraduate director back in, I think, 1993 in psychology for our 4,500, 5,000 majors in psychology, that I learned more insights about the research and teaching, and it wasn't just service. But there too, unlike most things in the academic world where you send a paper off and you're waiting months and you wonder if a paper gets accepted, if anybody actually ever reads it or not, when you're engaged in these kind of activities, you can see opportunities to make a difference right in somebody's life right in that day. And I was telling David about the story of a student who came to see me, and she was bullied into writing a makeup exam on the spot by a professor who had very strict rules about people who missed exams. And I saw her when I was undergraduate director, and she comes in, she's crying uncontrollably, which is not something that I enjoyed at all, because I never really know what to say. And I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that she'd been bullied by this individual into writing a test on the spot. And of course, it had wrecked her mark because she hadn't been prepared. She had legitimately been sick. That was proven. And I ended up dealing with that, since it was in my purview, as I just walked over to the other office, took a form, signed it, I put the grade back to where it was, and that was that. As opposed to writing an academic paper where you're sitting there wondering if it's ever going to make an impact. So I see these things as not only something that York prides itself on emphasizing, but they're interrelated. And ideally, they inform each other. And it's through the service component, through being undergraduate director, is where I really thought, this study on perfectionism is something that really needs to go forward in terms of, here's all these students who are struggling, exceedingly capable students, but they're struggling because of the impossible pressures that either they've put themselves under or other people have put themselves under. And then you have to help in terms of how to cope with this. Now, the 40% about what's up to you in terms of happiness, I'll just tell you what this means for me in terms of the 40%. If 40% was up to me, what I learned along the way. The first thing I learned was that preparation, hard work, motivation is much more important than ability or smarts. I saw this going right back to graduate school, where there was exceptionally talented, bright students, way more intelligent than me, who never finished because they were so wrapped up in pursuing impossible standards or whatever else was going on. And I always said, give me two people. Give me the person who's going to be the diligent worker, who's going to keep striving and trying. I'll take that person over the genius who's got all these characteristics. Because related to that is the second point, and this is out of work by Carol Dweck, a well-known psychologist, that when we look at how people evaluate themselves and their beliefs about intelligence in the world, there's some people who are called entity theorists, where they see intelligence and themselves as fixed entities, that you either have it or you don't, which is a very bad way to go about the world, because when things go wrong, and if you're not seeing yourself as measuring up, you think, well, what can I do? I'm stuck, that's the way it is. Much better as a process orientation, where you see that you are a lifelong learner, that you can improve, that you can strive tenaciously. And I found some recent data on perfectionism, where the perfectionism is usually something that's a bad factor in terms of outcome. But in terms of this way of thinking, was related to this striving, lifelong process in a way that should be good. So I asked one of my resident perfectionists, my wife, I said, how can this be? How can perfectionists be taking this sort of process entity view, but end up in such difficulty when things, and she says, well, it's about the goal. It's all about the goal. You need to have not only this approach of growing and striving, but you have to have reasonable standards and reasonable goals, because you're going to set yourself up for failure, even if you're going about it in this process-oriented. If the end point is something that's unattainable, even if you're going about it the right way, you're going to end up in difficulty. It's been one of many times where I would just say, so what's this all about? And then her, being much smarter than I, will quickly tell me. Related to this is the important point of striving for excellence, not perfection. And over-striving is not a recipe for success. Over-striving is a recipe for abject burnout. And I'll be talking about this in terms of some of the health issues related to perfectionism. But I was saying earlier that I've been asked to go and try and help out at a school in the Markham area where the school slogan is striving for excellence. Yet what's actually happening is with the enormous pressures that are on some of these kids, especially in the last year of high school, they're striving for absolute perfection. Not just perfection in terms of the attainment of a standard, but perfection in terms of a prescribed job that they have to have when they go through university. And it's a recipe for students crumbling by the wayside. And a key thing is to learn that striving for excellence actually has more benefits associated with it than striving for perfection. And in fact, I'd argue that what you get for striving for excellence is you get more of the benefits and nowhere near the costs that come along with this striving for these absolute levels of perfection. And by absolute, I mean absolute. I was once on the old CTV show, The Shirley Show, where they had a student who was there to tell her story about how upset she was because she had dropped from a 96% average to a 94. And of course, the studio audience is going, 94, bring it on, where do I sign up? But she said, no, no, and she'd also created this imaginary audience where the entire school knew that she had dropped from a 96 to a 94. And then typically they say, oh, they blame the parents. The parents must be pushing her. Now, they had their parents on there. Parents are going, we wish she'd just have some fun. We wish she'd just relax, learn how to be a kid. But no, she's got to make up for this 2% to get back up to a 96. And then if she got there, she'd want to go even higher. You know, and it was just making her miserable. So the striving for perfection just undermines satisfaction. I can tell you a little story here. About 2 years ago, Paul Schaefer from the Letterman Show was on his book tour, and he happened to be coming to the Chapter store near us. I thought, I'll go, but there's going to be 1 million people there lined up. I get there, because it was poorly advertised, there's only like 30 people there. So I had read on the internet that Paul Schaefer was a perfectionist. So I thought, I'm going to ask him about this, and we get a conversation going. And so I go up to him. I get up to him. I was going to buy the book anyway, which was part of the deal. And I said to him, so, Mr. Schaefer, I said, we have something in common. Originally, I'm from U of T. You went to U of T. I said, you're an author. I'm an author. I said, I want to ask you about this perfectionism. And I said to him, I said, I understand you're a perfectionist. And he looks right at me, all serious, and he goes, no, I'm not, man. And a Paul Schaefer wave, you know, him with the glasses and all this. And he goes, in fact, he goes, I'm willing to say if I was a perfectionist, I'd be dead right now. And I went, this is not the TV guy we're talking to. This is like, so then he starts to grill me about what is perfectionism and what does it mean and he said, what's the #1 problem with perfectionism? And I said, the #1 problem I can see is that people who are very accomplished do not enjoy their success because the success is not at the level that they're striving for, but it's a success that other people would be very happy to have. I said, so they have this very joyless existence. So then he proceeds to interrogate me for another 20 minutes while people are lining up. And I thought, what's going on here? Later I realized, I did a bit of internet surfing, and who is a big perfectionist? David Letterman. Who got treatment 2 years ago suffering from clinical anhedonia? David Letterman. Who's known to micromanage at the commercial breaks because he says everything is his fault if something goes wrong? David Letterman. Now, clinical anhedonia is essentially what I was describing. It's a joyless, you can't experience satisfaction or pleasure because, you know, there's always another way you could have done it. And celebrities in particular, perfectionists, are really prone to problems because they're so self-conscious and they're so out there. And we see with Mitt Romney, who's been said as somebody who might not be electable because he seems too perfect, because people don't like that either. What happens when he says something seemingly innocent the other night about binders of women. And I read that and I said, I didn't catch up on the wording there, but I thought, oh, Obama's in trouble with that because look at Romney actually went out of his way to try and create opportunities for women. And instead, what do they pick up on? The way he phrased it. It must mean that he's a bad guy. I wouldn't be voting for him if I was eligible in the US election, but I'm sitting there going, do they pick up on the fact that he was trying to do something ostensibly to create opportunities? No, the phrasing must mean some deep, dark secret. And then, of course, the spin and all the things that are going on with that phrase. So clearly, people are really punished if they're public figures if they make mistakes. And Jamie Lee Curtis talked about this recently on a PBS show, ironically a show that would be cut by the funding that Mitt Romney promised the funding cuts in the first debate. She said, I think the real problem with kids in terms of low self-esteem is that they're now seeing what happens when people make a mistake. And kids who make a mistake, it can be on Twitter, it can be on YouTube, so that you're really getting the message if you're sensitive to making a mistake, you better not make a mistake. And if you're already perfectionistic, it can get to the point of being paralyzing. All of this is much better off striving for excellence and realizing that anybody can make a mistake, especially political leaders. One thing I also learned very on is the importance of being an innovator, not a follower. When I started, I was doing some work on a construct called affect intensity, which is some people are very emotionally intense. An item on the scale is when I'm happy, I'm so happy, I feel like I'm in heaven. As opposed to the other people who are low affect intensity, happiness is a calm contentment that comes over me. And that intense affect is something that's associated with a lot of emotionality and remembering emotions and that. So I have about 5 or 6 publications on this, and one day I got a paper to review, and I see a spot where I should be seeing a reference of one of our papers because it exactly fit what the person said, and no reference to us at all. And I thought, well, there you go. When you're testing somebody else's constructs and ideas, the people that get cited are going to be the ones who are initiating it, who they're afraid are going to be the ones reviewing the paper, as opposed to me somewhere else who is on the periphery. And fortunately, with the perfectionism work that we did, it was a field that was ripe for a lot of new ideas that didn't have to be revolutionary to advance where we were, and also applied to something that affects real lives. And that's one of the themes talking about today. Also, especially for students who are sitting there thinking, I'm not going to have a job opportunity, you got to maintain that sense of hope that things are going to get better, like when people told me there'd be no job as a professor. But we know from Snyder's work in the hope field that hope is not just having a sense of optimistic outlook, but you need to translate that into skills and strategies and goals so that you can make it happen. You don't just need to say things are going to work out. You need to put in some problem solving and learn the specifics. In my case, one thing that turned it around for me as a student was, I remember introductory psych at the halfway mark, I had a 65%. I said, this is not law school material. This is not even getting a B in this class material. And then I had the good fortune of coming across a fellow student who I knew was in my class of like 800 people. And I said to him, how are you doing? He goes, oh, I'm acing the course. And I just sort of facetiously said, well, what's your secret? He goes, actually, I do have a secret. I said, tell me, you're not going anywhere. And it turned out that he had learned a way of studying that's based on some standard, very effective ways of studying. And he said, here's what you need to do in terms of finding some concrete ways of really learning the material based on the cognitive principle from one of my professors at U of T, Gus Craik, called levels of processing, where if you make the mind work harder, you're more likely to remember the material. Even if it's a multiple choice test, you can't just think, oh, I'll recognize it. So I started to do that, and by the end of the course, simply by having that strategy in place, my grade went from 65 to an 86 at the final. And I estimated out of 130 final questions on the last introductory test, I had to have got 123 right, simply by studying in a much more effective way. So when I would see students come in as an undergraduate director and they say, oh, I've been trying, I'm studying, they're actually overstudying, but they're doing the same inefficient things that they've been doing all along. And of all the students that I talked to, all but one saw dramatic improvement simply by coming up and using a variation on this strategy. The guy who didn't I saw him about a week later. I remember a guy, his name was Eddie. Eddie, how's it going? Did you try the method? Well, not really, man. What do you mean, not really, man? Well, I figured if I didn't fix my car, I couldn't get to the exam in the first place, so I worked on my car. So how'd your exam go? Should have not worked on my car. Maybe the car went off the rails along the way. So strategies are critical, and that's the same thing as a professor. You have to go about how to put yourself in the best position. Another thing I can tell you is my wife, who, when we met, she was the secretary. Another very good fortune thing was that she then got a job in the Office of Research Administration at the University of Toronto. So she would come back and she would tell me some of the lame brain things that faculty members would do that would get them no research funding, as opposed to the one, so I'm getting like a tutorial from the inside source. And she said her favorite was the professor who got turned down because he was going to have his wife as a research assistant for their European research that they needed to do. And his reason for why he needed to have his wife do this work was that his laboratory was in his mind and only she could read his mind. Didn't get funded. Don't know why. Anyway, I also learned through Professor Endler, who had chaired the national committee at SSHRC many times, the do's and the don'ts. So the mentoring is a key element of learning this. And the procrastination is something that has to be avoided. I'll just tell you a little bit about this. I've done some work on procrastination along with Professor Clary Lay, who's world expert on procrastination here. And how this combines with perfectionism can be particularly damaging. And this is illustrated in a paper that we have in a Canadian journal from about 4 years ago, where we did a survey of psychology professors and we assessed them on personality attributes and found, what do you know, that the conscientious professors had more publications with higher citation index. But the procrastinating perfectionists actually had fewer publications. And then some people say, oh, but they must have had better publications because they worked on these papers. And no, not only did they have fewer, but also papers with lower impact. And this shows you, first of all, the dangers of procrastination and the difference between conscientiousness versus the hyper-conscientious, excessive perfectionism, that there is a distinction there. And this, I find, is a great thing for parents who are pushing their kids over the edge. And they say, oh, my kid has to do this. And I say, you know, think about it. Professors who are at this level, striving with this pressure, actually don't do as well than colleagues who are achievement-oriented, conscientious, but striving for excellence rather than striving for perfection. And I've seen some amazing works from students that they would never hand in. But because they were thinking that it had to be this magnificent thing. In fact, they'd already far exceeded the expectations. Now, still got, we're almost at the hour, so I'll go faster. But I want to talk a little bit about personality. But one of the things I've already touched on is the difference between potential versus performance. And this is the big problem that I see, is that a lot of first-year students and students upper levels are saying, well, you know, I don't have what it takes. And I convince them, I say, well, you know, you do have what it takes. You just need to find other ways of getting about it more effectively. Because I tell them, you know, they actually convince themselves that somehow they got in by accident, that they're not as good. And I say, your comparison is not with your students in your classes. It's with all the people who couldn't get in the first place. And a very vicious component of this that people fall prey to in academic and non-academic settings is social comparison, where they go up to, like I did with that fellow, and said, you know, oh, how you do? And then he tells me he's doing an A. But what I find with social comparison at the university level is that a lot of it is based on false premises. What happens is that students actually misrepresent how well they're doing. I saw this one time in a fourth-year class. I hand back papers, and I listened to two young women at the break, and the one says to the other, I got an 87 on the paper. What did you get? And I'm looking down at my sheet, and she has 75. She was lying. But the person who she's now comparing thinks, oh, my God, I have to have an 87. and then is using that as a basis for self-evaluation. There's a lot of people who project doing a lot better than they actually are doing. And people look for cues because they're uncertain, and they judge themselves not knowing that they're judging themselves based on falsehoods that are out there. The other example of this is people who hand in a test early in a big lecture hall. I can actually see other students swearing. How did that SOB do this test in 20 minutes? 9 times out of 10, the paper is blank, and the person has had test anxiety and is getting out of the room. But nobody walks down and says, hey, look at me. I screwed up. I had a panic attack. You know, they put on the cool customer look, and then others use that to judge themselves. And it's all erroneous because it's based on this false performance. Now, the other thing I wanted to say here and talk a little bit more about personality is that one thing I learned very early on and objected to often was people would talk about students as if students are all the same, not recognizing the differences in students in terms of their background, whatever, personality differences. It's all this like students. And sometimes people would talk about students, and I would think, you know, have they ever actually talked to students? Have they ever actually sat down and got to know them like I did when I was undergraduate director? And the story I'll tell that will emphasize this is what I call the unhappiest student in the world. One day, a guy comes in for an advising appointment, and he's dressed in this bedraggled way, looking like he's the road crew for the Grateful Dead or somebody like that. So he comes in, he goes, oh, professor, I got a world of trouble. And I said, what's your trouble? I see, you know, you're not looking like you're having a great time. He goes, oh, money problems. I said, money problems. So immediately I'm thinking crushing student debt, you know, having to work, not having time. And he says to me, yeah, I got money problems, man, money problems. And I said, well, what is it, you know? And I said, the debt load? And he goes, no. I won $14 million in the lottery, and I'm serious. And you know what? Because my life has gone to hell in a handbasket. People who I thought were my friends or posers just looking for money. He goes, I'm the loneliest guy. He lived north of the campus. He goes, I got this big empty house and no friends. $14 million. So I told him, I said, well, with $14 million, you should use that to get some counseling. And I think you'll get some coping skills, I said, and realize that there will be people out there. But I learned right there, you might say, oh, yeah, this is, you know, this, and students are like this. Now, here's this guy, still wanting to go to university, though. That's interesting that he won $14 million, but it was important to him to learn and to develop, and he had $14 million. Somehow, I think the alumni people, fundraisers, missed this fellow. I should have stayed in contact with him. I could have been his life coach or something, or at least faked it in terms of what I know. So the unhappiest student. But one thing I wanted to say is that I'm very concerned about mental health issues in students. I just led an application that York has put in focused on the transition for first-year students. And some of this, like the students I've encountered, in part, I did a lot of teaching. I was always teaching for Atkinson extra courses. And sometimes I wondered if these people were coming my way because I was supposed to meet them in terms of wanting to continue to study this. And also, one of the things, I have an abnormal psychology textbook. So I did, for instance, work with a student who had multiple personality disorder at York. She told me that she was with a group of 7 or 8 other students who would meet regularly, all with multiple personality disorder. You may have read a debate about whether this exists. I actually saw a transformation in front of me one time where I have no doubt in my own personal views that it does indeed exist. And in this case, it was some past maltreatment was indicated. There's also what I call the case of the disappearing student, about students though, because there's been more than one. My very first thesis student, when I was studying that affect intensity variable, just disappeared one day. She needed an extension for health reasons, which she never really told me why, but I supported it. And then I saw her, she got the extended time for the thesis. I saw her in June of my very first year. I'd almost been at York a whole year. And I see her and she says, I'm just printing my thesis upstairs and I'll bring it down. And I told her, I said, you don't need to. You're not due for another month. You got extra time. I'm not pushing you. No, 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 it's done. I'll bring it down to you. 20 minutes. I sit in my office, 20 minutes, no sign of her. 30 minutes, never comes. Next day, nope, not at all. Don't know where she went. Immediately I'm thinking Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Where did she go? 7 years later, I'm standing in virtually the exact spot where I saw her. And I looked down the hall in the behavioral science building and said, here she comes. I think it's her. 7 years. She comes up to me and she goes, hi, do you remember me? And I said, yeah. What happened? She goes, well, there was a guy who was stalking me, and when I went upstairs, I saw him, and I was too afraid to ever come back to campus, but now I'm back. I said, okay, like you couldn't leave me a note or something, you know? Then she looks at me and she goes, I have one question. I said, what? She goes, is it too late to hand in the thesis? Seriously, this happened. I'm not making... Another time, I'm teaching my 4th year seminar in Very Hall, and I had 3 presenters, and they would do a psychobiography of somebody famous or infamous. And I had 2 presenters before the break, and then 1 after the break. So we do the first 2 presenters, and then we're ready for the third. The third one, again, disappears. Her stuff is there, her purse, her coat. What happened? She had a panic attack, and she ran right out of the building and kept going. Now, she was very brave because she came back like 8 weeks later, and we still found a way for her to do the work. But I said, you know, this is serious. When you are going to jeopardize your academic standing in a 4th year course that you need, you know, and we got to really work on resilience and coping. That same course, I won't tell the Argyle Sox because he might find me and sue me, but Argyle Sox actually is a student who threatened me, and I was just waiting for something really bad. It was smart enough to threaten me up to the point where it would be my word versus his. But in that other class, the seminar class, I had another student one time. I come and I'm waiting outside. I'm just getting into the class, and I see the student standing outside. And it's always a bad sign when the student presenter is standing outside waiting to talk to you before you get into class. So the student says to me, she goes, here's the deal, Flett. No Dr. Flett, no Professor, no Mr. Flett. Here's the deal, Flett. I said, what's the deal? She goes, well, I have social anxiety disorder, so this has implications. And I said, I wish you would have told me this sooner. I could have tried to help, you know. Well, she goes, I'm still willing to do the presentation on one condition. I said, what's that? She goes, nobody in the class can look at me at any time. I said, how is this going to work? She goes, oh, I've done it before. She goes, I will stand at the back of the room. I'll have my PowerPoint at the front, and nobody is to turn around and look at me. And she goes, and especially you. You even come close to eye contact, and I'm out of here. Now, this is a class on psychopathology, so the class actually thinks I'm making this up. No, I'm not making this up. So anyway, we get through that, and the whole time the class is looking at me, and I'm looking at them, and it was a great presentation, because of course she didn't want to make any mistakes. But then we realized that her co-presenter is more disturbed than she is. And nobody had told me about that, because she's got this colleague she's teaching with. Student gets up there, the second one, now we can have eye contact again. At about the 10-minute mark, the student starts yelling at me, the course instructor. She just starts yelling, and the class is now, she says, stop laughing at me. I said, I haven't laughed at you, and I have never laughed at a student, and I never will. The day I do is the day I quit. You're laughing at me. Well, it's obvious to me she's got fragrant paranoid personality issues. I said, no, I said, if anything, I said, I may be smiling, reflecting on the amazing bravery of your fellow presenter and the unique experience we've had here today, but I'm not laughing at you. Now the class is all like, oh my God, what is going on here? Where did you get these people from? Well, they're York students who are dealing with a lot of pressure and issues and family upbringing, whatever it is. And again, about another 20 minutes in, she just stopped, went quiet, looked at me and said, I told you, I'm warning you. I don't know what she was going to do to me if she really thought. And again, the class was like, what is going on here? And my point is that we've got students who've got various forms of issues. And even if the most adjusted student walked in the door, we've got some issues with the stress and the transition and the standards. But if they come in, they're vulnerable already on top of all that. We've got a lot of work to do. But it's a wonderful illustration. We're talking about psychology and real people, real problems. And there's lots of room and lots of work for us to do. Now, before we run out of time for questions, I wanted to zip ahead and talk about this. There was a paper by Ozer and Benet in the Annual Review of Psychology it was about personality and consequential outcomes. And this really sums up why I do and what I do and how I go about it. What they said is that personality is dramatically underestimated in terms of its impact on what goes on in life. And what they did is they analyzed different areas and showed that personality differences have consequences in terms of looking at individual level, the person, interpersonal relationships, and at the societal level. So at the individual level, they said personality is a factor that's going to be associated with better or worse outcomes in terms of physical health. And my research chair is on personality and health, which reflects the role that personality factors play. Happiness, we've already talked about in terms of the formula and where personality is determining like 50% of it. Also, sense of identity in terms of a very tangible thing for people in terms of how they see themselves. But to show you the personality and health aspect, a paper was done in 2009 by Canadian researchers that used our measures of perfectionism in longitudinal research. And they found that perfectionism, studied over 7 years in this group of middle-aged to older Canadian adults, predicted early mortality, early death, even after controlling for other personality factors like emotional stability versus neuroticism, optimism, which is a protective factor, conscientiousness, which is a protective factor. Perfectionism, even after controlling for those other influences, predicted early death. And this is something we almost had an experience with. My wife, who I showed you, about 18 months ago, had a cardiac event that actually she came within 3/4 of an inch of not being with us anymore. And I've been saying for years, you know, the stress that's associated with being very perfectionistic will end up taking its toll. But and I told her I would talk about this because one of my ulterior motives is about promoting awareness of female cardiac health issues. Because we're sitting at the table, just having a regular conversation, and suddenly she gets this funny look on her face, and she says, I don't feel well. And I said, well, what's the matter? And Kathy says, well, I have indigestion. I'm going to lay down. So I said, well, that was kind of abrupt. I've never seen that before. But she said, oh, it's just indigestion. So she goes and she lays down, and then for 3 or 4 hours at one point, I was rubbing her back and kind of burpy. But then she said she was okay and actually fell asleep and was happy and content and that. So, but I said to her, well, if there's any further signs of this, we got to go to the hospital. So what does she do? She's a classroom teacher now. Off she goes to work the next day. I said, you're okay, right? No reoccurrence? No? Well, that wasn't exactly true because that wasn't the case. So she was actually experiencing a heart attack and went off to work and worked 9 hours with a heart attack in progress because the diligent, dutiful perfectionists, that's what they do, right? They're goal-oriented strivers. So when she comes home and she walks in and she says, this is now 6 o'clock, I was working at home that day, trying to rearrange some things for my student's dissertation defense because one of his examining committee members had gone into early labor, which wasn't part of his thesis agreement. So we just get that worked out, and my wife comes in, she goes, you know, I should probably tell you that feeling I had never ever really went away. So I said, we have the monitoring system at home. So I said, go check your blood pressure. 210 over 110. If you know blood pressure, you know that 120 over 80 is prescribed. When you get up to 160, 170, you're heading to the stroke territory possibly. She's 210 over 110. So I said, get your coat. We live near Credit Valley Hospital in Mississauga. I said, get your coat. We're going to go over there. No, I don't need to go over there. I said, either you get your coat or I'm making the call, your choice. So we go over there, and within an hour and a half, and it's quite an experience too. You know, I know in sociology they talk about biographical disruption events where your life and your identity is no longer the same. It's quite a thing to have, within an hour you go through and they do some blood tests, which will tell whether you're having a cardiac event. And a perky, blonde doctor comes in and says, just matter of fact, yep, you're having a heart attack. Just matter of fact, no sense of, hey, there's a person here who might not be wanting to hear such an abrupt announcement like this. But then when we finally got her tested, we discovered that it wasn't just a heart attack. In fact, it was an arterial tear. And here again we see, now fortunately she's fine now, or I wouldn't be telling this story. But it turns out when we go see the cardiologist 6 weeks later, when we finally get an appointment, the cardiologist, not being Joe Psychology, says, let me show you where you had your heart attack. And he actually says to my wife, Kathy, he goes, I don't understand why you're having this problem to begin with. He goes, you're not overweight, you don't smoke, you don't drink. He looks at me and he goes, you're the one who should have had the heart attack. Thank you. I haven't had enough stress already. Like, oh yeah, I'm overweight, news bulletin there. It's genetic. My aunt actually at one point weighed over 300 pounds on the Flett side. We have this issue. That's what I keep saying anyway. 40% within my control, right? Anyway, the doctor actually says to her, so matter-of-factly, he goes, let me show you where you had the tear. And he goes, and it was on the lower part of the heart. He goes, you had your tear here. And then he points about a ½ inch higher, and he goes, and if you had it there, you're dead. Like, so you get to now live with the, oh, you're a ½ inch away from being dead. And because of where it was, they couldn't do anything. So they hope they repaired it. And it seems that it naturally repaired. But we don't know. They said they would do more damage to try and repair it. And then he just cavalierly, oh, and another inch, you're dead. So then what happens? There's issues with some nightmares and things like that. So, the only way I can explain this is our research now consistently shows that perfectionism is associated with exceptionally high levels of stress. And even when things are not stressful, perfectionists can find a way to make it stressful because they worry about the next time it will be demanding or stressful. And we call this self-generated stress, where people make their lives more stressful. We have a joke in our house because I've never seen people get so upset if the 5-day weather forecast says it's going to rain in 5 days' time. And I just end by saying that I learned about this as an alternative way of looking at this when we went to see Jerry Seinfeld back about 6 months ago. He does a whole thing about the Weather Network, all clean humor. And he goes, here's something to think about. He goes, that 5-day forecast that people get so upset about, he goes, if the 5-day forecast was accurate, people would only look at the Weather Channel every 5 days, which is true, right? And we know that chaos theory and random events all came out of weather prediction and how inaccurate it is. So anyway, my main point for all this was about there are personality factors that are linked with health outcome issues. But we also know that personality is something that affects relationships in terms of marital and family adjustment, also affects peer associations. And personality factors predict those people at the societal level who are going to be engaged in less pro-social activities versus more pro-social activities. And there was even a recent study that was done that looked at right-wing conservative authoritarians and their views on environmentalism and events versus those who were less likely to have that personality style. And not surprisingly, you find that the more authoritarian people have a more let's leave the environment alone approach to things, as you see sometimes allied with some of the political parties and their differences towards environmental issues. And what we know from research on people who are authoritarians, who like to call the shots, is that one of the factors that's contributing to this sort of anti-environmental approach is they tend to react in a somewhat hostile way if they feel threatened, and they feel threatened by change in particular. They like things to be predictable. So they don't want to hear about how things are going to get and how it can't be controlled because they like to have control. So what has to happen then is to try and keep things in a much rosier view when in fact it's pretty evident that we do have a problem in terms of these issues. I think it was announced earlier this week that September was the hottest September on record since they started making measurements of this in North America ever. So, but it comes back to people who are in policy positions and have very different views on what is the way things should be, and some of this is tied to their personality. So how's that for, I'll end on that note and see if there's any questions, and thank you for your attention and putting up with my stories.
I'll let you field questions directly.
Can they use the mic?
Yeah, so they want me to remind people, if you have questions, to use the mic. I know I kept bobbing and weaving from the mic here.
If you don't have any questions yet, let me start the ball.
Okay, okay.
You mentioned procrastination along the way.
Yes.
A month ago, we had a workshop here in Calumet College
Yeah.
for first-year students engaging in transition to university.
Yep.
And the speaker offered a solution for procrastination problems. How many of you suffer from procrastination?
Right.
I'll tell you how to do it.
Right.
What would your advice be to students who
Yeah.
feel that they procrastinate?
Can you just repeat the question?
Yep. The question was, what would my advice be for students who procrastinate? Because a solution was offered by a speaker a month ago. It's a complicated thing because there's different reasons why people procrastinate. Most students and people in general, it's a fear of failure, but people are naturally procrastinating when it's a task that's just too aversive. And some people, it's because they're sensation-seeking, rebellious people. But I find it, generally speaking, procrastination goes back to that fear of failure component and the sense that people feel that they need to put off the inevitable failure that they're going to experience or the negative feedback. But what ends up happening is they make it a self-fulfilling prophecy because they end up never actually doing it or the like. In terms of what it comes down to is that they really need to have a sense of confidence about themselves that can be built by learning some of the strategies that I talked about in terms of how to study, how to manage your time. But if they do find themselves delaying because the load is just too much on them, not pumping it up into something that's more magnificent than it actually is. I've seen students do this where they think, okay, well, I'm going to need an extra day. Now he or she must expect this, when in fact what they just want to see is it gets handed in. When it's perfectionism, they have to be convinced that the perfectionism is not required, that good enough is good enough. And I could tell you a very brief anecdote about this since nobody's raced up to the mic over there. My wife's teaching partner's son wanted to get into architecture. Now, he is exceedingly perfectionistic and indeed did get into architecture, which I'm not sure is good for him in terms of it will further amplify his perfectionistic tendencies. But way back when he was in high school, parents were getting divorced, and the student didn't come home from high school on a Friday. So the mother is panicking. She's thinking, pretty sure I wasn't married to somebody who'd be one of those types of parents who, absconds with the child or something, but where is he? So she's starting to panic as the hours go by. Now what had happened that week was that they had an assignment where they had to build something, and he decided to build the Air Canada Centre during a Raptors game and did an amazing job. And this was back in the era when one of the Raptors players was Jalen Rose. During that week, Jalen Rose was traded. So now his project is not perfect. Most kids would just hand it in and say, this was pre the trade, but no, he had to fix it. So what does he do? He goes back to the school after everybody's gone and convinces the custodian to let him in. And his mother finds him in the school at 7 o'clock on a Friday night after she figures out there's only one other place he can be, and he's there fixing his project, which, he could have had. So it's actually due on the Monday. So the Monday comes along, she figures, well, he's fixed it, it's all this. The teacher phones, male teacher, and says, I got to tell you, he never handed in his project, and I don't know what to do because I know that this kid is so perfectionistic. If I give him the grade that he deserves, he's going to have a meltdown emotionally. So what the teacher astutely decided to do was to dock him in terms of learning style, but not take away from his actual mark. Because on Monday, he didn't hand it in again because he said, I can still make this better. So there's a case where he could have technically lost out entirely if that teacher was more hard case about it, but he didn't. And part of it is to know when enough is enough. Like what I find with procrastinators, it's the difference between the person who couldn't get started versus the person who couldn't finish. And often the ones that get most jeopardy are the ones who started and done this amazing amount of work and they couldn't finish because they're expecting that this doesn't have to be just something that's good, it has to be great, or they're letting somebody down. So dealing with how the process is evaluated is part of it. But really what they're doing is they're compensating for some self-esteem issues. And still nobody at the mic, so I'll tell you another story from when I was undergraduate director. I got a million stories. Sadly, I didn't get to the story about the woman who hopped in my car and asked me to marry her. That's for another time. But it actually happened to me, and then it gets worse from there. It's my example of situational factors that, anyway, one time I'm undergraduate director and a student comes in February and he says, Professor Flett, I need to talk to you about doing an honors thesis. And I said, well, that's great, you're way ahead of the game. I said, you need to get a supervisor for next year. And he goes, no, not for next year, this year. I said, man, it's February of your 4th year. You mean you haven't started your thesis? You haven't? He goes, no, I know I'm supposed to. I can't graduate. I said, that's right. So my initial reaction was to want to sort of get in his face and give him a talking to. And I thought, reading Professor Lay's papers, this guy has probably already been pretty self-critical and beaten himself up more than I could ever hope to in terms of an inspirational speech. So I said, well, you're not going to find somebody at this time of the year, and you're really behind the 8 ball. He goes, oh, I have to. So he says to me, he goes, you know what? He goes, I could probably get in. My dad's a principal of a high school, and I could get in there. And I said to him, well, I know that there's been no research at that point on procrastination in high school students. And I said, I have some interest in that. So I sit down. I said, all right, I'll supervise you. Here we go. Worked it out. Week later, he's got a set of questionnaires. Off he goes to do this project. And I'm thinking, hey, this is going to work out for both of us. But no, that's not exactly the way that it ended up. What happened, he went into the disappearing student category. I can't find him. The phone number, he's not answering the phone. Where did he go? Disappears. So he shows up, and the only time I've ever had to do this, I had to put in an F on a student because there's no work, no nothing. It would have been better not to show up to my office in the first place. So he comes finally in June, and he says, I guess I sort of owe you an explanation. Hark. He said, I guess I sort of owe you an explanation. And I said, no, and I'm giving him false hope. I said, there's no sort of and guessing. You owe me an explanation. He goes, oh, I was painting. I said, the Sistine Chapel? What were you painting? I was painting. So being a fish, or supportive of students, if you want to call it that, I said, look, you still got to get the credit. I'll give you another chance. Okay. If you let me, I'll go in, I'll do it. Exact same thing happened. He goes into apparently the student witness relocation program. He's disappeared. And I'm thinking, how many times, I'm going, but what is going on in terms of, what has he built this up now in his head as in terms of what I'm expecting? Because I'm there to give him whatever help he needs, right? So now what do I see come across my desk? And this is also a life learning lesson. He writes a petition saying that he should have this F removed because his faculty supervisor was unsupportive and unavailable for him to complete his thesis. Not realizing that the first thing the petitions committee does is contact the undergraduate director, who is me, and ask for my opinion. It was one of the shortest conversations with the petitions people you ever heard. And I just thought, what could he be thinking that, he's going to get away with this after? But all he had to do was essentially go there, work it through, come back. Now the question is, maybe he couldn't actually get access like he said. Maybe he had misrepresented that. But all he had to do was tell me that, and then we would have figured something else out. Instead, the avoidance. And that's when avoidance, there was a case of a procrastinating perfectionist one time who was an accountant. And not only was he not doing his own tax returns, this is his job, he's not putting people's tax returns in because he can't finish them, it's his job. And you think, what's going on? And they've got no sense of confidence, and then they need to have that planfulness and come up with an approach that'll work and a time-managed strategy. I don't know what the magic solution was a month ago, but it can get very complicated for some people. And the media treat the procrastination as sort of like a funny topic until you can talk about marriages that have fallen because somebody was such a procrastinator or whatever. And, it's a very serious problem that usually is accompanied by excessive self-criticism because people know they should be doing it, but they can't. Anyway, about the other thing, about the woman who hopped in the car and asked me to marry her, those were the days when you didn't have automatic locks, or it would never have happened. But can I have 2 minutes to tell this story? Because it'll be something you want to take home with you, I'm sure. There's nobody at the mic. Will you please tell us the story of the woman who hopped in the car? It was at the end of my talk. I was actually going to talk about it anyway. Because one of the things I think we forget is the role of situational factors. We blame the person all the time. I was trying with that procrastinating student not to blame him, that maybe he had something going on. So when I was a graduate student, my very first year, I was picking up a friend up near the airport, and I lived in the Mimico, Tobico area. And I'm driving along Lakeshore behind a streetcar, and I'm stopped waiting. It's a Tuesday. I keep the facts the same. Tuesday, 4:12 in the afternoon on a fall day. And I see this woman on the south side of Lakeshore sort of waving. I said, who is she waving to? Where is she going? And she walks behind the streetcar in front of my car, opens my car door, which was only open because I was going to be in a no stopping zone to pick up the friend at the airport, hops in my car, turns to me and says, will you marry me? At the time, I was totally single, but I wasn't in the marrying mood. It wasn't a nice day for a white wedding. So I said, no, I can't. And she says, why? 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 She goes, are you married already? I said, that sounds good. I'll go with that. Yes, I am. Oh, she starts crying buckets of tears. Oh, all the good ones are taken, just like I said years ago when I met my actual wife, right? So she says, take me for a ride. And I said, I think I'm being the one. I'm looking for the candid camera, like, cash cab, what is this? So she says, take me to Kipling and Lakeshore and I'll get out of the car. And I said, promise? Because by now I've got a parade behind me, people waiting, the streetcar's ready to go. So off we go, and she starts asking me questions, and I'm going, oh, please get the Kipling and Lakeshore, please get the Kipling and Lakeshore. So she asked me, how do you like my uncle? I said, I don't know your uncle. Well, but do you like him? I said, it's 50-50. I said, yeah, I guess he's okay. Oh, I hate him, and she starts crying again. It just goes on. She asked me if I'd take her drinking in Scarborough. Now, obviously, this was somebody who had clear adjustment problems, right? So we get down to Kipling and Lakeshore, and the situation that was going to be just a mild story now becomes a horror story, because here's what happens down there. I pull up to the streetcar stop. She's thanking me, gets out of the car. I'm about to drive away, and suddenly I hear all these people screaming and shrieking at the streetcar stop. Well, what happened when I'm about to go is that she accidentally caught her coat in the door. So I'm driving, and she's being pulled on the outside. And now it looks like I kicked her. I break her heart by not marrying her, kick her out, and then run her over for good measure. And, so I stopped the car. Now, it turns out it only happened for about a foot or two, and then the coat ripped, and then she's on the floor. So I say, what am I going to do? I cannot believe this. My first proposal ends up with me running over this poor lady. So I get out of the car, and suddenly I'm like Harrison Ford in the Fugitive movie, because literally I go, there's a phone booth over there. We didn't have cell phones in those days. I'm going to go, and I'm going to phone for help. And a police car comes out of nowhere and cuts me off like I'm the fugitive. And a guy, I still remember his name, Officer George Brown, badge 230, gets out of his car and he says, so what seems to be going on here? Let me see. Oh, so a woman you don't know hopped into your car, asked you to marry her, wouldn't get out of the car, and then for good measure you ran her over. And I kept saying to him, officer, I know this sounds ludicrous, but this is the situation that I find myself in. He goes, no, he goes, keep telling me the rest of the story. And I kept saying, shouldn't we help her? Because she's now like face down, making a heck of a lot of noise. And I said, shouldn't we? No, tell me the rest of the story. So eventually he says, all right, let's deal with her. And I said, well, I thought you're not supposed to move people when they're potentially injured. He goes, let's get her off of the street. So me and him and about 5 others help her, and she's a bit of a burly woman, so it wasn't easy. I always say a large brown coat with a tire mark. Anyway, we get her into the back of the cruiser, and I'm in the front, and now I'm like this, I can't believe this is happening. And suddenly, and she's wailing away so that I can't hear him, he can't hear me, he can't check my insurance, and suddenly it's quiet. I think, oh no, she's dead. But no, he turns his head back to her, she pops it up, turns to the police officer and says, will you marry me? Thank you. Now, I'm not making this up, and then she started to say, don't take me to Queen Street. And then I said one of the stupidest things I'd ever said, because another police officer comes, and now an ambulance, and the cop thinks it's so funny, and I'm not enjoying it. And finally I said the stupidest thing I ever said. I said, I'm in psychology, and this woman needs help. And they said, buddy, you don't need to be in psychology to know that this lady needs help. Anyway, apparently, she couldn't even say who she was. And in the back of the ambulance, she said, don't take me to Queen Street. So, of course, the first thing they did, after they confirmed that she wasn't really hurt, she'd wrenched her arm a little, fortunately. They take her there, didn't know who she was. So there's an epilogue to this story, 2 epilogues. And remember, the moral of this story is sometimes you can find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's not, hopefully, anything to do with you. My friend who I was living with comes to me about 4 months later, and he goes, that woman? He goes, what did she look like? It was kind of dirty blonde hair, a brown coat with a tire mark up the side. I said, yeah, that's her. He goes, well, she's down there in the kiosk of stores with the young guy saying that she really liked him. And I said, she's back. So fortunately, I avoided that second connection, that second love connection there. But when I was lecturing and telling the story, and I do talk about this in the personality course on the person-situation interaction and how sometimes a situation can be so overwhelming that it doesn't really have any room for personality differences. I tell this story, and a student comes up and she goes, you want to know the real sequel to your story? And I said, what? And she goes, my ex-husband also met that woman. He goes, when did this happen? I said, well, it was when I started graduate school around 1980, 81. He goes, yeah, that would be the time. And she goes, and unlike your story, which was traumatizing, she goes, I actually enjoyed the story when it involved my ex-husband. So I said, well, tell me what happened. She says, well, she goes, I know you don't believe this. I said, no, I'm a believer. Trust me, I'm a believer. I believe anything. Got swampland for sale, I believe. She says, well, her husband was a chemical salesman, and he was driving along the Gardner, and for some reason, it was about 2 in the morning, and the lid got knocked off one of the things in the car, and he was starting to be overcome by the fumes of the chemical. So he stopped on the Gardner, near that same area of the lakeshore, actually near the fancy club down there. And out of nowhere, on the Gardner, this woman lurches up and says, will you marry me? And it's the same woman. I don't know, if you got to feel so sorry for her, right? So he says, no. Why? Are you married already? Yes, I am. Same thing, right? At which point, being obviously upset with being rejected by several prospective suitors, she grabs the keys from his car and takes off, jumping the guardrail, heading towards the Boulevard Club on the lakeshore. He goes, now what do I do? Because those were his only car keys, and he's sitting there in the Gardner with no way to drive his car once the fumes clear. So he takes off in hot pursuit of her in the direction of the Boulevard Club. And he gets to the Boulevard Club, the fancy club, and he hears some rattling, so he figures, I don't know how she did it, but she must have hopped the fence, and she's in there. So he hops the fence, only to discover that he didn't hear her. He heard the 2 Doberman pinschers that were inside waiting for him. And while he's being attacked by the Doberman pinschers, he sees her silhouette at Lake Ontario throwing his car keys in the direction of Buffalo. So she says, I know you don't believe this. I said, oh, I believe it. She goes, the next day she brought in the Toronto Sun article, because not only did he get attacked, the police charged him with trespassing, not believing any of his story. And when he told the whole story, they said, yes, we have forever's record of this poor lady. Now, that shows you anything can happen, any place, any time, if you find yourself in a situation. But then, maybe that's when I really became interested in mental health. I said, because why, this was the area of the intense deinstitutionalization. Why was this poor woman who can, out there in the streets in the first place? And after they see what happened, back out she goes. So truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. Yes?
Did she actually have like a mental illness, or was she?
The question was, did she, nobody was ever able to determine, but obviously she had to have some functioning issue. I mean, it could have just been, some intellectual deficiencies or the like. But the police officers did tell me, remember when she asked, do you like my uncle? Well, we believe that her uncle was a police officer, so that when she saw the police officer, that's why she started to freak out, because she hated police as well. But they got the situation to deal with.
But it sounds like she almost set herself up for rejection, because to approach people that you
Yeah.
don't have a relationship to, and you're asking them a very pointed question,
Yeah.
and they say no, you've got to expect that people
Yeah.
are going to say no.
The point was about how she sort of was setting herself up for rejection. And I don't know her circumstances, but I can tell you that a big thing in the psychology literature on stress now is this notion of self-generated stress, where people will make choices or put themselves. We used to think that stress was something that just happened to people, but in fact, people can go about their lives in a way that makes it much more stressful in terms of who they want to be with or avoid, or not handing in stuff when they could easily hand in stuff. It just builds up the stress, and that people can have a role to play. And I asked myself the question, these people who have a history of doing this, do they know that they're making it more stressful, or are they oblivious to it? In her case, she just had reality testing issues that I'm sure maybe she couldn't even remember that this would happen more than once. So, but yes, but I'm in psychology, and this woman needed help. Well, are we done?
Well, Gord, you have given us an entirely new meaning in experiential education. I'm sure people may have individual questions for you, but we've kept people beyond the
Yes,
time that
yeah.
they were committed to and that
Yes.
you were committed to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like you to give you a Calumet College
great,
bag
great.
full of Calumet College
Beautiful
stuff.
Thank you. I'm ready.
And thank you very much.
Thanks. Appreciate it. And thanks for being so attentive and listening to my stories. Because otherwise I have to stop people on street corners and just start talking randomly. Thanks.